Okay, good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Thank you. Welcome. I'm Alice Abreu, and I serve as the chair of the tax section. In my day job, I'm a tax professor at Temple Law School in Philadelphia. So welcome to the 2025 Midyear Tax Meeting. We're pleased to welcome nearly 800 of our esteemed colleagues to the beautiful city of Los Angeles for this newly reformatted meeting. I want to start off by acknowledging the tumultuous times that we're living in at the moment and the impact that they are having and will continue to have on the tax system. As I wrote in the message I recently sent to our members, helping to steer through these transitions falls squarely within the mission of the tax section of supporting the development of an equitable, efficient, and workable tax system. The tax section and the ABA have been vocal proponents of the full and adequate funding of the IRS and will continue to defend and support the crucial role of the IRS and the Treasury Department in a variety of ways, and I'm very proud of that. But now, thank you. But now let us try to make the most of our time together as a community of tax professionals. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors whose support make this meeting possible. Our diamond sponsors, Castellanets and Tax Notes. Our ruby sponsors, Aon, the Asbury Law Firm, Kaplan and Drysdale, Dentons, Lockton, Morgan Lewis, Nelson Mullins, Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law Graduate Tax Program, Chartis Freeze, Nelson Taylor Amatrano LLP, Winston & Strawn, and Winthrop Weinstein, and all of our Emerald sponsors listed on the screen. I also want to recognize Thomson Reuters and the educational affiliate of the tax lawyer, the Northwestern Graduate Tax Program, for their long support of the tax section, including their sponsorship of this year's Careers in Tax Dinner for law students, and Taylor Nelson Amatrano for their support of the Law Student Tax Challenge. So thank you. I am proud that we started this meeting by supporting the local community in the wake of the devastating wildfires of last month. Today, tax section volunteers were at the Los Angeles Regional Food Bank and packaged over 1,000 meals for people in the community. It was a wonderful way to connect with our hosts and our fellow attendees. If you're interested in other pro bono initiatives, please register for our virtual settlement week, April 2 to 4. Additionally, nominations for the Janet Sprague's Pro Bono Award are due right after this meeting on March the 3rd. Next, I want to recognize our committee leaders, speakers, and section counsel for their tremendous work in putting together this meeting. I often say that the tax section would be nothing without their generosity and commitment of our leaders, but this meeting was especially challenging given the new format. I can't tell you how grateful we are for your patience, flexibility, and collaboration, and we hope to receive your feedback. So when we ask for it, please, we are all ears. We really want to know. And finally, I want to take a moment to thank the tax section staff for all their hard work to restructure this meeting and ensure its continued success into the future. They work really hard, and they are fabulous at what they do, and those of us who are in leadership are the beneficiaries of it. So thank you. We are pleased that we are again holding the final rounds of the Law Student Tax Challenge, our client counseling competition for JD and LLM students, throughout the day tomorrow. As those of you who have had the privilege of judging or observing the oral arguments know, These future lawyers, hopefully tax lawyers, work really hard to prepare for these final rounds. Because the plenary now starts the meeting, like right now, I can't announce the winners, but I invite you to join me tomorrow for the Law Student Tax Challenge Awards ceremony from 5 to 6 in Plaza 3 to celebrate the accomplishments of this year's semifinalists and finalists. In other good news, our fellowship programs are strong and growing. We are thrilled to now have 3 classes of Loretta Collins Argret Fellows. You can see their names on the screen. I encourage you to spread the word about the application for this fellowship. The next class of this Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Fellowship, for which applications are due May 31st. I also want to welcome the 2024-25 class of Nolan Fellows. These are mid-career tax lawyers who are actively involved in the section and who have demonstrated the qualities of leadership and a commitment to the section's mission. You can see them on the screen. I'd also like to recognize our Christine Brunswick and tax analyst public service fellows who work in low-income taxpayer clinics for 2 years, providing valuable legal assistance to vulnerable taxpayers. And you can see their names and pictures on the screen. I'm further pleased to announce that we have launched a 3rd public service fellowship, again, thanks to the support of tax analysts. The 2025 Tax Analyst Summer Fellowship will support 2 JD or LLM students for 10 weeks over the summer. Applications for that are due March 17. All of the fellows have green ribbons on their name tags. If you see one, please congratulate them, even if you're also a fellow, and especially if you're a longtime section member. And you can go even further to support the next generation of tax lawyers by signing up for our new student mentorship program. The QR code that you see on your screen is included on page 21 of the meeting program. Shifting gears now to publications. After nearly 10 years at the helm of our ABA Tax Times electronic journal, Professor Linda Beal has turned the editorial pen over to a new editor, Jessica Jean. We're grateful to Linda for her dedication and look forward to Jessica's tenure. Stay tuned for updates on the new phase of Tax Times. And now, the last thing before I welcome our plenary panel, I'd like to invite Wells Hall, former chair of the tax section and chair of this year's nominating committee, to announce the slate of nominees for the 2025-2026 Tax Section Council. Wells.
Thank you, Alice. The nominating committee consists of 15 members who have a broad background in many areas of the tax section's activities: meetings, CLE, committees, publications, pro bono, government relations. 5 members are selected each year or nominated each year to serve on the committee by the chair-elect. So they serve for a 3-year term, and this, as you can see, will provide some continuity in the leadership and the appointment of the leaders of the section. This year, the nominating committee started meeting in the fall, and we had our final meeting in January to select the new members of the section council and the officers of the section who will commence their terms in August of this coming year, August of 2025. For council directors, if we can move to the next slide, our nominees are Deborah Herman from New York, Scott Levine, Washington, D.C., Ali Petrova from Greensboro, North Carolina, David Richardson from New York, and Lanny Villalobos from Washington, D.C. For the officers of the section, move to the next slide, we have Lisa Zarlinga, who has been selected to serve as our chair-elect. Here for Lisa, who's in the room, by the way. You'll have a chance to speak to her on your way out. For Vice Chair of Pro Bono and Outreach, Susan Morgenstern. This was the one Vice Chair slot that came up. These are 2 or 3 year terms, so there's not a new one every year for every slot. For Assistant Secretary, Nancy Rossner from Richmond, Virginia. And Morgan Cleansing will move from Assistant Secretary to Secretary pursuant to our section bylaws. And Megan Brackney of New York will become our chair commencing in August of 2025. The council will officially elect the new slate in connection with the ABA annual meeting in August. Alice, the leadership of the section is in good hands, and it has been my pleasure to chair the nominating committee this year.
Thank you very much. And now, as befits our theme for the evening and our location, we're going to go to the movies in spirit. For that, I'm going to turn the program over to Professor Katie Pratt, who is the John E. Anderson Professor of Law at Loyola University Law School here in LA. And Katie is going to interview Steve Bank, who is at the Paul Hastings Professor of Business Law at UCLA's Law School, and who has been working on a forthcoming book on how the Hollywood royalty who faced those 90-ish% mid-century marginal rates glamorized tax avoidance and not only made it a national sport, but also influenced Congress's approach to tax legislation in ways that we still feel today, and so much more. So please join me in welcoming Professors Bank and Pratt to the podium, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice, and welcome everyone to the plenary session. As Alice mentioned, Steve Bank is the Paul Hastings Professor of Business Law at UCLA School of Law. He attended the University of Pennsylvania, where he earned his bachelor's degree, and he attended the University of Chicago for law school. He was destined to become an academic during law school. He served as co-editor-in-chief of an interdisciplinary legal studies journal. He was a Bradley Fellow in Constitutional History. He received the Francis Bouston Outstanding Comment Award, and he was a prize winner in the American Journal of Tax Policy Student Writing Competition. Between law school and UCLA, Professor Bank clerked for the Honorable Jesse Eschbach of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit and practiced with the Dallas law firm of Hughes and Luce, focusing primarily on mergers and acquisitions and corporate and partnership tax. He also was an associate professor at Florida State University before he came to UCLA. He's been at UCLA since 2002. He teaches, of course, many tax courses, but he also teaches business associations, and he has a particular interest in soccer and sports law, so he also teaches courses in those areas. During his time at UCLA, Professor Bank has held various leadership positions at UCLA Law School. He has served as the faculty director of the Lowell Milken Institute for Business Law and Policy. He has served as the vice dean more than once, which says something. He also was the faculty director of the law school's program in business law and policy. His main research focus is on the taxation of business entities viewed through the lens of legal and business history. He's published numerous articles in chapters in the fields of business taxation, tax policy, and tax history. He's authored or co-authored numerous books, including Anglo-American Corporate Taxation, Cambridge University Press, From Sword to Shield, The Transformation of the Corporate Income Tax, 1861 to the Present, Oxford University Press. His fabulous book, War and Taxes, Urban Institute Press, along with casebooks and business tax stories. His articles have been published in many prestigious journals, and his work has been selected for the Stanford Yale Junior Faculty Forum, and he received the John Minor Wisdom Award for Academic Excellence in Legal Scholarship. He's been a visitor at the University of Cambridge, and he's lectured at the UK's Inland Revenue on the development of the US and British corporate income taxes. He also has written extensively on the double taxation of dividends. He's also a frequent commentator on soccer law issues, and he teaches courses on international and comparative sports law. So he is an eclectic tax lawyer and legal historian. So today, our format is that I'll be asking Professor Banks some questions about his book so you can learn a little bit more about it, and no doubt you all will buy the book when it is published. It will probably be published late 2025 or early 2026. So before we get into the book, I wanted to first ask you how you became interested in legal history, specifically the intersection of taxation and legal history.
Yeah, thanks, Katie, for the very generous introduction, which went through a lot of my history, I suppose. So I had historical training in undergrad, very interested in it, but also interested in tax and business. And what I found was that historians didn't touch tax. When I learned more about tax, they got it wrong when they touched it. The tax lawyers had no time to learn about the war profits tax of 1917. They had enough trouble with the current tax law. So it was an open area, and it was I thought an interesting area, right? So it was just a way to combine those two interests, and very few people were doing it.
Good. What was your motivation for writing this particular book?
Yeah, so the book, which I should clarify, it's tentatively entitled High Rates and Low Taxes, Tax Dodging in Mid-Century America. This is only one chapter from the book. It's the first chapter. Goes through executive compensation, tax havens, expense accounts, withholding, a whole number of areas where we have this kind of mid-century inflection point. High rates, a huge increase in the number of taxpayers, and a huge increase in the number of tax lawyers, accountants, retail tax advice. H&R Block starts around this period. A huge increase in people offering financial advice columns. So you see most of the newspapers that started the kinds of like tax report that you have in the Wall Street Journal start around this period. Just a massive increase in salience of tax for the population, and a question about how do I get around it. And so that was part of it. But the academic motivation for it was there's a debate in the academy that many may be familiar with, which is should we go back to the rates, the good old days when we had a 91% top marginal rate? Because in the 50s and 60s, maybe the economy wasn't so bad. And so Thomas Piketty is most famously associated with this, but Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman have written about this. And so there was a quote in Saez and Zuckman's book where they address a critique of they aren't proposing to go back exactly to 91%, but somewhere very high rates. The critique is that, well, they didn't pay those rates, right? 50s and 60s, people didn't pay those rates. The effective rates were much lower. And they said, yeah, but they were like 50%, and that's still pretty high. And tax dodging, and this was the quote, tax dodging was largely in check. And I looked at that and I said, what are you talking about? Tax dodging was in check in the 50s? I said, all right, now these guys are economists, so they can invent the screwdriver on a deserted island and open the can. They can do whatever they want. But still, I was like, you got some academic integrity here. Where are you finding out that it was in check? And by the way, 50% was really high too, because they include state and local taxes and a whole bunch of other things. But regardless, that was the original motivation. I said, if people are forgetting what was going on in the 50s and 60s, then I have a job to do. Moreover, the focus in most of the discussions in the academia about the 50s and 60s is about the top 1% of the top 1%, right? The really uber wealthy. And so I wanted to look at how did tax dodging pervade society in the 50s and 60s.
Great. Perfect segue to the next question. Throughout the book, you're using the term tax dodging instead of using the terms tax avoidance or tax evasion. So how did you decide to use the term tax dodging throughout the book?
Yeah, this is one of those things where when I started writing this, I was all over the map with that. And I realized the reason I was all over was because this was a shifting term even during the time. First of all, tax dodging is a very 1950s term. Newspapers used it all the time. It was a term that existed before the 50s, but it was a term that they kind of settled on. So in some sense, it was a period term. But the reason I moved is because the term itself had moved. So in the 20s, teens, tax dodging was unpatriotic. It would be kind of being called unpatriotic, really. It was the worst insult you could provide to someone as an American. And then lawyers and accountants started making this avoidance evasion distinction, right? Well, of course you're allowed to avoid. You simply cannot evade. Evasion's legal. And I was like looking at the contemporary sources for the lawyers, and then I was looking at the popular sources of discussion of this. And the popular sources were like, I don't know what you're talking about. And before the war, all of it's immoral. Well, everything's immoral. Avoidance, evasion, the idea of tax planning, the idea of municipal bonds being tax exempt was considered awful. Like, how can these rich people be doing this? That was one of the things that post-crash in the investigations of the cause of the stock market crash were like, can you believe that J.P. Morgan and everybody associated with his firm didn't pay taxes? Well, yeah, they had net operating loss carryforwards or they had capital loss carryforwards because of the stock market crash. That was considered like a scandal. So that's part of this is Roosevelt came in the New Deal and he said, I don't care which it is, it's all wrong. We've got to get rid of all of it. In the 50s, things started to shift. And so that shift is what I'm looking at in some sense in the book. It shifted from, it doesn't matter whether it's evasion or avoidance, it's all wrong, to, you know what, a little dodging here, a little chiseling there, it's all kind of good. And that shifting is where tax dodging is what became respectable, and people kind of ignored the fine legal distinctions, and frankly, the courts kind of had trouble keeping up with it. So that's why I ended up deciding it's about tax dodging.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Little fact for us in Los Angeles, since our team, the LA Dodgers, was formerly the Brooklyn Dodgers. So you may or may not know why the Brooklyn Dodgers were called the Dodgers. They were called the Trolley Dodgers because they had to dodge the numerous trolleys traversing Brooklyn. So Brooklynites became very adept at literally running in between moving trolley cars. So that's how we got the name the Dodgers. So in the first chapter, you start out the book by focusing on movie stars in the mid-century period. So why did you begin the book with movie stars?
Yeah, the movie stars are really interesting. So a couple issues. One is, when you think about the income tax, you're not really attacking the wealthy. Right? The really wealthy people who had property, that's not income tax. Right? So who were the people who were the highest income groups around this period? They were celebrities and corporate executives. And corporate executives is my second chapter. But celebrities, by an order of magnitude, at the top, were far, far more income. So just to give an example, at a time when the General Motors CEO, Charlie Wilson, was the highest paid CEO in the country at $626,000, which this is 1950, which was about $8 million in 2025 dollars. Frank Sinatra made almost $4 million, which is about $53 million in 2025 dollars. So, it was no comparison. Moreover, there's a couple things that are unique about celebrities that were really interesting for what I was looking at, which is how did tax dodging pervade society? Celebrities had lumpy income, so they had big years and they had weak years, so they were very much interested in the kinds of schemes that deal with what we would consider like sell the business deals, like how do I shelter my gains from those. They had that every other year. They were well advised. They had an army of lawyers, accountants, and investment advisors. So one, some of you may know, I don't know what the age of the audience here is, but A. Morgan Murray was the investment advisor to the stars, and he realized very quickly investment and tax advisor to the stars. So he had a stable of 60, 70 of the top celebrities in Hollywood, and he would match them with the deals that could cut their taxes. And so there were a ton of the shelters, and these are the oil shelters, cattle shelters. So you might note that Natalie-clad gentleman out with the cattle. That's Alfred Hitchcock with his cattle. He literally said he was investing in a cattle shelter, and he said, "I want to go see him." So he went to, I think it was Kansas, or Nebraska, I can't remember which, and that's him that's with his cattle. They were the oil and gas. So you see, do I have it on there? Maybe I took it off, but Bing Crosby and Bob Hope were famously partners in oil, and that was oil shelters. So much so that some of the oil executives started investing in films because they just wanted to go the other way. So in any event, they were very much in that era. They were very much able to invest in all these shelters. But it wasn't just shelters. They had unique jobs. There were some things that just entertainers had. They could leave the country for long periods of time and still be working. They could, this is the end of the studio contract era and the start of the customized contracts for these sort of celebrities. They could get paid in however they wanted to. They operated in a world in which, unlike the manufacturers who had sort of hard assets, they had intangible assets. They had intellectual property. They had a way to be able to sometimes be operating with a sale of their assets and sometimes a sale of their services. They also had the ability to negotiate out of different entities, right? And so they had a lot of things that a lot of average workers don't have. So very unique. So it was just an interesting, and then to top it off, and really the start of the book is this part of the book is about high-profile tax dodging. The second part of the book is the democratization of tax dodging. And the high-profile tax dodging introduced, most notably with celebrities, a generation to the notion that, hey, these people who we admire, who are good people as far as we can tell, they dodge taxes, that's okay, right? And so it was a very, easy way to entree into the book's main theme.
Good. You discuss many different strategies that movie stars use to reduce their taxes. So you start off by talking about something that doesn't surprise anyone in this room, the aggressive use of business expense deductions. So what do you think are some of the more outrageous examples you use in the book?
Yeah, well, so some of these are examples that are just aggressive deductions, what we would call, the kind of unreimbursed miscellaneous business expenses. Like James Cagney has $5,000 for dancing lessons and, $400 for massages. The wardrobe kinds of deductions. So Madge Evans, and some of these are names from the 30s. So the 30s to the 70s is about the mid-century, but 50s, 60s is my focus. But Madge Evans famously declared in her wardrobe that everywhere I go, I'm presenting my image. My image is my business. I have to wear certain clothes and I certainly can't wear something more than twice. So, and I'm sure Alice is not going to wear that more than twice, so she better get her use out of it, right? So some of it was that, but some of it was they figured out that what I needed to do is generate losses. And the best way to generate losses is to take really, really bad businesses and start running them, and those were their hobbies. Horses were their hobbies. So you had lots of these guys were in horses. Gary Cooper, this is now my business, even though I had horses. They, like the cattle example, oil, it wasn't just Bing Crosby and Bob Hope, it was Jimmy Stewart, Gene Autry, all these guys. I mean, Gene Autry made his money in oil, not in films. So a lot of these guys, it was the normal thing. In fact, oil was so popular among entertainment executives and entertainment stars that they all knew about the 27.5 flat percentage depletion deduction. And Ronald Reagan, when he was the Screen Actors Guild, testified before the House Ways and Means Committee about, and he was testifying about something else. It was really about income averaging, a way in which they could sort of reduce these sort of high tax rates in years in which they had a film. And then he started veering off into, we think we're just like oil. We're risky, like we have this risky adventure. And the quote, I think, from it is that we're about as short-lived as an oil well and twice as pretty. Right? And so he argued there should be a human depletion percentage deduction, which I can get on board with because I feel like I'm sort of declining a little bit. My best year, I don't know, something like that. So they all knew about the oil side of it. They also, so those were kind of in the business side. They would run businesses. And they had everything. The businesses sometimes helped some of their other stuff because they needed to have in corporations, and we'll talk about this, as Congress started cracking down on some of the use of personal holding company type corporations, the solution was to put in things that were outside of their service income, like their other businesses. So they would put them all inside the corporation, or they'd start new ones. So you had, you had them dealing with side businesses. Gracie and George Burns licensed furniture. Who knew? I didn't know you could buy licensed couches from the two of them, but okay. Al Jolson managed prize fighters, right? That was one of his other side businesses. So they all did that. It was all part of generating something to put into the pool and soak up the income that they had other activities from.
Yeah. So you go through various discontinuities in the income tax and show how the advisors to the movie stars, pressed on those discontinuities. And just to give everyone a frame of reference, can you compare the ordinary income rate for individuals versus C corps, and then the ordinary income versus the capital gain rate in this mid-century period?
Yeah, so from 1951 to 1963, the top marginal rate is 91%, right? So that's, every time I hear someone complaining about a tax, that's a tax, right? Let's be serious. I actually, some of you may have heard of Vester Hughes, who was the name partner at the firm in Dallas that I started with. He used to say 1939 code, that was a code, right? which I was appreciated, but I didn't know anybody else was like, what are you talking about? But the top corporate rate was 52%, right? So, all right, 91% to 52%. The top capital gains rate was 26%, right? So you can imagine if you can get down to capital gains, you're hitting the home run. Corporations are pretty darn good. And if you could chisel away, and this is what they would talk about, chiseling away, that was another name for tax dodging, because it was like, I'm not doing really major stuff, I'm just chiseling a little bit here and there. They would chisel away down so they weren't at the 91% bracket either. Fairly significant. And again, the celebrities were the ones who were hit with 91% in any given year because it was an annual rate. And in that year, they happened to be very highly paid. So that's the context, the big difference. There's some other discontinuities, if I can address this, that were really unique for celebrities. U.S. versus foreign income, right? Huge. So you can be, as a celebrity, not only can you, and this is sort of the original remote worker, not only can you work away from Hollywood, but you can work away from the United States. And they did. They're, in one case, they took advantage of a massive exemption, essentially, a massive provision that wasn't intended for them. And I don't know if you might want to talk about it later, but I can go through it here.
The 18-month club.
The 18-month club. So I don't know if people heard of the 18-month club. So in 1951, Congress passed a provision. It was part of Section 119 of the Code, and it was designed to encourage. It was designed to remove the discontinuity between people who lived abroad, U.S. citizens who lived abroad, and those who went over temporarily. Why? Because you can imagine 1951, a bunch of U.S. workers, skilled workers, are going abroad to help rebuild Europe, to help work on oil and gas lines, to rebuild kind of the energy supply, and they needed them to go temporarily over, but they were taxed at a much higher rate than the people who were living over there. So they created an exemption that if you went temporarily overseas, that is, you stayed overseas 17 out of 18 months, you would be exempt from U.S. tax. You'd have to pay the tax in the country you're working in, but the U.S. tax rate at 91% did not have many peers. So how long does it take to make a movie? You can make 2 or 3 in 17, 18 months, and tons of them did. And so, for example, and I don't know, these are old movies, so some of you may know this, some of you may not. Roman Holiday. Now, you think about Roman Holiday, you say, well, of course, it was filmed in Rome, right? It wasn't going to be filmed in Rome. William Wyler, the director, insisted that it be filmed in Rome so he could avoid taxes. And the way these films worked, they hired local talent, but they had to have, for an American interest film, they had to have either a U.S. director and at least 1 or 2 stars. And the tax differential was so great that Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck, they go over there, they take a cut rate on their salary because they don't have to pay taxes on it in the U.S. And so that's how you get Roman Holiday in Rome. They could have done it in a soundstage. They could figure that out in Hollywood, but they went to overseas. And there's a huge number of people who went overseas. William Holden, Yul Brynner went over. It was tons of films. It got so bad that the American Federation of Labor's Hollywood Film Council calculated that the number of films shot abroad increased by 40% after 1951, after this provision, right? So it was massive. And they were, the International Association of Theatrical Stage Workers were upset. All the unions were upset because they lost all their jobs. The jobs went abroad. Sound familiar to anybody? So then you've got the switch. Okay, so now you have to really go abroad. And so they did. So lots of stars moved permanently to places like Switzerland. Audrey Hepburn went to Switzerland. William Holden, one of those. John Huston, Maltese Falcon, went over, said, I will never shoot a film in the U.S. again. I know that will affect what I can film, but I will only film abroad. So if you're wondering why, there was a period of time in the 50s and 60s, we had all these films in kind of exotic locations that, was there just natural interest because of the war and world locations? No, it was tax dodging. It was simple tax dodging. Now it was not the only reason. There were other reasons. Money was frozen because of currency restrictions post-war. So the U.S. studios were also trying to get the money back some way. They basically wanted to launder their money by filming abroad and use that money over there. Other mechanisms they did that are probably very familiar to most of you: loan-out corporations, collapsible corporations. Those are film star originated, right? I mean, that's not to say that they're obviously only used by them or historically, but when they were trying to figure out how do we get some of this advantage, they're looking at the corporations saying, why are they paying they're paying half what individuals are. We should be able to get that. The studios are getting a deal. So they formed corporations, right? And they either formed the collapsible corporation, right, where they shift they only do it for a particular film, or they sell it, or they form it for the loan-out corporations where they're earning their money and, for their personal services inside the corporation so they can cut down their tax rate. And so you see Variety, look, Ma, I'm a corporation. These were important parts. This isn't just how I'm a corporation. They started running in the financial advice column series, how you too can be like one of these guys and form your own corporation. So you started seeing doctors and lawyers and others try to figure out how can we also put our personal services income inside a corporation so we can get that rate. Other discontinuity, we just talked about capital gains. So obviously, massive. Jack Benny over there on the far left, you too can be Jack Benny. Save money by capital gains tax. And by the way, you too cannot be Jack Benny. The guy was hilarious, right? But you too can do capital gains tax dodging. So Jack Benny put his radio show inside corporations, sold the rights to the radio show from NBC to CBS. And CBS did that as a whole play, entertainment-wise. They bought a whole line of shows from NBC. You'd think this would be controversial, right? This is right out there in the open. Not only was it out there in the open, but they advertised it as their capital gains TV show, or no, radio show lineup. The capital gains lineup. It was in the press everywhere. Everybody wanted to do this. So that's another example. Plenty of others followed suit. Rita Hayworth, Joan Crawford. Those of you for TV, you may have seen Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. Desilu Productions, right? That was their corporation, right? You own the rights to your show. All the money's going inside the corporation. So these were right out there in the open. Everybody could see them, and they were taking advantage of them, and they were uniquely available, uniquely situated to take advantage of them. Not everybody could do that. Wage workers couldn't. Your W-2 worker couldn't do that.
Right.
But this was absolutely something that they were doing.
And the corporations paid low salaries and retained earnings, and then
they would pay a nominal salary too. All these things were lower salaries because what you wanted to do is you wanted to sell the rights. You wanted to sell other intellectual property. Another example of this, Amos and Andy. Anybody remember Amos and Andy radio show? Right, Freeman Godson and Charles Correll. They sold the rights to their characters to CBS rather than getting paid by CBS. They got $2 million for the rights to the characters. That's converting it to capital gains, right? That was their whole play there. Everybody, tried to find some way to do this. On the lower left, Jose Ferrer, judge rules Jose right, IRS wrong. That was the sale of his interest in the play Moulin Rouge for the movie rights. He wanted that as capital gains. They wanted that as service income for his starring in the film. He won. At least he won at the district court. So. These are the kinds of things they were exploiting at the time.
Yeah, you also talk about how movie stars arrange for multi-year deferrals of tax.
Yeah, so in the second chapter in the book, I talk a lot about deferred compensation, and I think executives were highly influential because part of the price they got for deferred compensation, because they didn't want 91% rates, was to spread that to the rest of their employees. That was politically diffusing the attention on it. And so if everybody in their company was doing it, Congress was kind of okay with that. And as we know, Congress ended up adopting what today nobody considers tax dodging. The ability to defer your compensation for retirement is 100% was a tax dodge in the 50s that became, this is responsible tax planning. This is good for society. This is helpful for, because we don't actually want to fund retirement for our populace. We want the businesses to do it. All good. But the time was definitely part of that. Who starts that? The big stars. So William Holden, Bridge on the River Kwai. That was my dad's favorite movie. Somebody must have seen that. He thought that was greatest. He negotiated a deal to do the film that he would be paid over 20 years. Okay, 20 years, fine, you're deferring, but that's, time value money. The cap was $50,000 a year. Right? He could not be paid more than $50,000 a year. He did not want to hit the higher rates, so he deferred it. Milton Berle signed a 30-year deal with NBC that was, designed to push some of his income out to a period when they expected the rates to be lower. Right? Now, some of this you have to understand the period in deferred compensation. Both executives and celebrities did not think the 91% rate would last very long, and yet it did. And then they thought, well, of course, when it goes down, it's really going to go down because that's what happened after World War I. But it only goes down to 70%. Right? It's not that much down. So a lot of these deferred compensation, again, become institutionalized, become part of the plan. Because, okay, no longer can we say, let's defer for a couple of years. It had to be deferred, long term, because he had no idea what the rates were going to be. So.
Yeah. And you talk a lot about the tools the IRS had or didn't have to reduce tax dodging by movie stars. In other words, they tried a number of different litigation strategies, and Congress enacted legislation, but it never seemed to do the trick.
Yes. So, I don't. In the chapter, and in the book generally, I talk about how, in a lot of ways, Congress looked the other way to a lot of tax dodging, partly because they did not actually believe 91% was a legitimate rate. But Eisenhower was insistent we cannot lower the rates. He did not want to be the Republican who comes into office after decades of Democrats, and now suddenly we lower the rates for the rich. He was I know this sounds quite controversial today, but he was a Republican who did not believe in deficits. So he wanted to cut the spending before they did anything that was cutting taxes. So the IRS was dealing with a Congress that had a rate that they said, we don't really care about that rate. We don't even care about anything in the top echelon. And so they tried to make examples of people. So who do you make examples of? Celebrities, right? You get in the newspaper, whatever you do. How did that work out? Let's see, Groucho Marx wins his tax case. Jose Ferrer wins his tax case. Kathleen Windsor won a really interesting tax case. Now, I don't know, do people know Kathleen Windsor? That's not a film star. So she wrote a book that was horrible. Forever Amber. I mean, awful. Everybody panned it. This was an awful book. And they argued that in court. She's not a writer. Look at the book. This is a hobby. What are you talking about? And the judge bought it. Judge said, this is not her profession. She's just writing this. She got back $26,000 because you know what happened to Forever Amber? It was one of the first romance novels. Forever Amber became so popular among the average, the regular public. She's called the mother of the modern bestseller. She wrote the most popular romance novel of all times. It was, it sold millions and millions of copies. And it was a tax strategy that actually got her in the papers. So what happened is they get in the papers and the IRS would lose. That's really bad news because everybody's looking at it and say, these people aren't winning. Sometimes they did lose, though. Bud Abbott and Lou Costello lost in a case. And by that point, they were just kind of sad sacks. And, it was really, I think, Bud Abbott who was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. And he was so sympathetically portrayed in the press about this that the public, they didn't remember you didn't win. They remembered how can they be treating poor, these poor guys. Mickey Rourke, how can you be treating Mickey Rourke this way? So sometimes they won, sometimes they lost. Congress, what happened with them? Well, it's an age-old story. So, as many of you know, Section 341, collapsible corporations, right? So we're going to deal with the corporations. And in the Gabriel Zuckman, Emmanuel Saez book, they talk about how, that's an example where Congress shut it down. So sure, there were some things, but they shut it down. But in the press and in the legislative history and in the academic commentary at the time, like, wow, was that watered down? Like, yes, you had legislation, but then it was watered down so that anybody could solve this problem by one of the things I talked about. You put more of your regular businesses in with your service businesses, and you're good. So there were things like that. The personal holding company rules, as many of you know, never really were very successful, difficult to prove unreasonable. They cut down on the 1951 provision that they were unintentionally gave the movie stars the right to go abroad. They just went abroad, right? So a lot of things they were chasing. First, they were chasing ghosts, right? So people were adapting. This group, but also just generally the investment advising group, got really sophisticated about the kinds of advice they were giving. So they were way ahead of the service, and Congress was not a willing partner and was easily lobbied to water down the provisions. One thing that was particularly interesting for the long-term effects of this is oftentimes when they tried to really crack down on something. So for example, later in my book, I talk about expense accounts, which is very much a Hollywood thing too. Romanoffs in Beverly Hills, like you couldn't be at Romanoffs without hearing tax discussion, oil discussion, and celebrities sitting there with the film stars. The expense accounts, John F. Kennedy wanted to go after them. That's where you end up with the rules that limit travel and entertainment deductions, things like that. But he did it as the press eventually figured out, but wait a minute, you're saving money on that, on expense accounts, to increase money for investment tax credits. And you break down the sort of moral force for it. And so a lot of people were able to continue with these activities. They were watered down. The whole ability in travel and entertainment, as long as you have a business discussion before or during, and so you would be at, for example, the Lakers game maybe today, and you'd have a little conversation. How's business? Good. Check. Right? That was the ultimate of ways in which the celebrities did it, because as many have detailed, but I talk about a little bit in the book, every Hollywood party was deductible under those rules. Because they'd say, that's how we do business, right? We talk about films, we talk about all of this stuff during our parties. So it broke down pretty substantially, and it may have inspired more people to do tax dodging.
Okay, so our time is almost up, so I thought we would close by asking you what you would say the biggest takeaway is from the book.
So the biggest takeaway from the book, and it's sort of not revealed in this chapter, is that if you go back to my original motivation for this, we're talking about the really high rates. So people say the high rates led to tax dodging. And my takeaway is actually, it's not the tax rates that were the problem. I mean, really high rates are obviously an inducement to dodge taxes. The problem is that they didn't have the political will to cut the taxes, so instead they did explicitly, so they did it implicitly. A lot of these tax dodging, they allowed tax dodging to occur. They enacted half-hearted legislative fixes for them. They enacted special exemptions. The Louis B. Mayer amendment, if anybody knows anything about that, that was targeted at him specifically for his profit share after he retired. All sorts of ways in which they mitigated the taxes. That's the problem. You can have high tax rates if everyone's in agreement, and we did in World War II. Over 90% of the people said they thought the tax burden was fair. And this is a time when most people were first-time taxpayers. But when that consensus broke down, that, hey, we need to all buckle up and pay really high rates, they didn't lower the rates. They did it the kind of backhanded way, the backroom way, the non-transparent way, the non-equitably allocated across society way, and that just never works. And so that's the takeaway.
A good reminder as we head into new discussions about rates. So thank you very much, Steve. I encourage everyone to buy and read the book.
so looking forward to this program, and you have not disappointed. So thank you so much. And last night, I walked down the Spanish Steps in Los Angeles. Who knew? That was where that iconic picture of Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn is in Roman Holiday. So thank you very much. I would like to close by expressing my appreciation to all of you for being here and for your involvement in the tax section. I also want to remind you that our 2025, this year's, May tax meeting will be held May 8 to 10 in Washington, D.C. at the Marriott Marquis. So I look forward to seeing all of you there. And now, please join me, in addition to thanking Steve and Katie, also join me at the welcome reception, which will be held in the Gold 2 and 3 ballrooms, which I believe are downstairs. And enjoy the programming over the next day and a half. Please be sure to complete the evaluations that will be mailed to you at the conclusion of the meeting, and let us know how you found this new track programming. So thank you and enjoy.